Introduction by Richard Pevear. For English readers, the author of The Master and Margarita needs no introduction. The novel, which was first published in Russian in 1966 to 1967, 26 years after Mikhail Bulgakov's death, appeared at once in 2 English translations, both of which are still in print, and it has acquired 4 more over the past 50 years. Bulgakov wrote 2 other novels, The White Guard in 23 to 24, and theatrical novel also known as Black Snow, though the author himself called it Notes of a Dead Man in 1936. The first 2 parts of The White Guard were published in the magazine Rossiya in 1925, but the magazine was quashed before the 3rd part could appear, and the book itself came out only in 1966. Theatrical novel was not published until 1965. Bulgakov began the first version of The Master and Margarita, called The Engineer's Hoof, as early as 1928, went back to it repeatedly during the last decade of his life, and dictated the final revisions just 3 weeks before his death on March 10, 1940, at the age of 49. He believed that it would someday be published, but he had no idea when. He entrusted it to fate. The strange publishing history of these 3 novels, which are among the finest works of 20th century Russian literature, testifies to the enormous disorders and the equally enormous orders that overtook Russia in the early 20th century. If we first became aware of Mikhail Bulgakov as a novelist, however, in Russia, his literary reputation during his lifetime and for many years after rested chiefly on his work as a playwright and an all-around man of the theater. Bulgakov began work on The White Guard when he was 30. But he had already been bitten by the theater as a young boy in his native Kiev. For Bulgakov, writes Anatoly Smelyansky, the theater was to remain a place full of the naive magic and mystery, the colors and smells which were an inalienable part of the provincial theater of his youth. Footnote, Anatoly Smelyansky is Comrade Bulgakov Dead, translated by Arch Tate, London, Methuen, 1993, 18. I am much indebted to this detailed account of Bulgakov's life in the theater by one of the directors of the Moscow Art Theater and the rector of its School for Academic Studies. As he himself put it, he had the stage in his blood. That's the end of the footnote. Bulgakov's parents belonged to the Russian intelligentsia. His father, Afanasy Ivanovich Bulgakov, an essayist and theologian, was a professor at the Kiev Theological Academy. His mother was a teacher. Their son remained loyal to those origins and, at considerable risk in revolutionary times, proudly defended what he called, quote, the finest stratum in our country, end of quote. In high school, he became interested in literature, theater, and opera, and during the summers he took part in amateur theatricals. However, on graduating in 1909, he enrolled in the medical school of Kiev University. In 1912, he wrote his first story, quote, "You'll see, I'll become a writer," end of quote, he said to his sister. But he also continued his medical studies. When the First World War broke out, he volunteered for the Red Cross and was sent to the front, where he was badly wounded. Later, he was sent to work in various provincial hospitals before he finally returned to Kiev in 1918 to start a private practice. But by then, there had been the 2 Russian revolutions of 1917, followed by the Civil War, which continued in his region until 1921. This period was especially chaotic in Kiev and the Ukraine. There were many warring factions: the Red Army of the Bolsheviks, the anti-Bolshevik revolutionaries, the pro-imperial White Army, the Ukrainian nationalists under Semyon Petlura, the Ukrainian anarchists under Nestor Makhno, and foreign forces from several countries. Between 1918 and 1920, there were some 14 coups d'etat. In 1919, Bulgakov was recruited into Petlura's forces. He escaped only to be mobilized by the White Army and sent as a doctor to the far-off city of Vladikavkaz in the foothills of the Caucasus near the Georgian border. There he decided to abandon medicine definitively and began to write for the local newspaper. He also wrote his first plays, 3 of which were staged in the city's theater between June 1920 and January 1921. In that same year, he sent some of the plays to a competition held by the newly organized People's Commissariat of Education in Moscow. I dream of Moscow and the best theaters in the country, end of quote, he wrote to his sister. On September 27, 1921, He stopped dreaming and moved to Moscow, where, as he wrote, quote, "I arrived with neither money nor luggage and stayed for good," end of quote. At first, Bulgakov found work in the literary section of the People's Commissariat of Education, but soon he started writing for several newspapers, publishing a great number of articles and sketches on a great variety of subjects, some of which were collected under the titles Notes on the Cuff and Notes of a Young Doctor. In 1925, he published his first book, a collection of 5 stories entitled Diaboliad, and by then he had also finished the final version of his novel, The White Card, an extraordinarily lucid depiction of the terrible events that overtook Kiev during the Civil War, as experienced by an intellectual family, the Turbans, and their close friends. He had already begun work on a dramatization of the same material with no particular theater in mind, when in April 1925 he received out of the blue a note from the director of the Moscow Art Theater's second studio, inviting him to come and discuss matters of interest to both the theater and the author. The studio was seeking new plays for its next season. The director had read the 2 parts of The White Guard published in Rossiya and proposed that Bulgakov adapt the novel for the stage. On August 15, 1925, he presented the play to the assembled company of the Moscow Art Theater. It was the moment, writes Anatoly Smelyansky, when the lifeline of a great theater crossed with that of its new author. End of quote. Chekhov's seagull became the symbol of the Moscow Art Theater when it was founded by Konstantin Stanislavski and Vladimir Nemirovich Danchenko in 1898. Bulgakov's adaptation of his novel, retitled Days of the Turbans, became the signal production of the post-revolutionary Moscow Art Theater. It premiered on October 5, 1926, and had run to 987 performances by 1941, when it was interrupted by the war. Bulgakov was immediately drawn into the collective life of the Moscow Art Theater in his work on the adaptation, which involved collaborating not only with the actors of the younger second studio, but also with the 2 old masters of the theater, Stanislavski and Nemirovich Danchenko. Their work over the next year was intense, turbulent, at times confrontational. At one point, Bulgakov even wrote a formal letter to the directors threatening to remove the play from production. Yet this was and remained the world and the work he had looked forward to from Vladikavkaz. During that same time, he also saw his topical satire, Zoika's Apartment, staged by the newly founded Vakhtangov Studio Theater. The 2 plays premiered in October of 1926, The Turbans on the 6th, Zoika on the 28th. 2 years later, in December 1928, his play The Crimson Island opened at the Moscow Chamber Theater. All 3 of these plays were warmly received by the public, but they were denounced by the ideological critics and theater functionaries of the time, who kept accusing Bulgakov of being a reactionary, an anti-revolutionary, a class enemy. Through their combined efforts in newspaper articles and behind closed doors, they finally managed, in 1929, to have the plays banned from the repertoires of all Soviet theaters. With his prose writings also banned, Bulgakov was left in a desperate situation. In September, he wrote to the government asking for permission to go abroad, but received no reply. In March of 1930, he wrote again. This letter was addressed to 7 members of the Soviet government, including Stalin, whose copy was handed to him in person by the deputy director of the Bolshoi Theater. It was a long and bold letter, ending with an extraordinarily direct appeal. Quote, I request the Soviet government to take into account that I am not a political activist, but a writer, that I have given all the fruits of my labors to the Soviet stage. I ask it to be taken into account that for me not being allowed to write is tantamount to being buried alive. I appeal to the humanity of Soviet power and request that I, a writer who cannot be of use in his native land, be magnanimously permitted to leave. If what I have written is not convincing and I am condemned to a lifetime of silence in the USSR, I request the Soviet government to give me work in my special field and find me a permanent post as a stage director in a theater. If I am not appointed a director, I ask to be given a permanent post as an extra. If I can't be an extra, I ask for a job as a stagehand. If this is impossible, I request the Soviet government to do with me what it finds fit, but to do something, because I, a dramatist who has written 5 plays and is known in the USSR and abroad, am at the present moment faced with poverty, the street, and ruin. Footnote. Quoted in the article Bulgakov's Fate, Fact and Fiction, 1966. Written by Vladimir Lakshin, translated by K.M. Cook-Florgy, Moscow, Verduga Publishers, 1990. That's the end of the quote from Bulgakov's letter as well. This time, Bulgakov received a reply. It came in the form of a phone call from Stalin himself. His wife, Elena, noted down the brief conversation afterwards. Stalin, we have received your letter and read it with the comrades. You will have a favorable answer to it, but perhaps we should let you go abroad, eh? Are you really so sick of us? Bulgakov, I have thought a great deal recently about whether a Russian writer can live outside his country, and it seems to me that he can't. Stalin, you're right, that's what I think too. Where do you want to work, in the art theater? Bulgakov, yes, I would like to, but I asked about it and was refused. Stalin, well, you send an application there, I think they will agree. And so they did. Bulgakov was immediately issued a contract and remained affiliated with the Moscow Art Theater as dramatist, adapter, director, and actor for much of the coming decade. Many questions have been asked about Stalin's intentions regarding Bulgakov. Perhaps as an absolute ruler, it suited him to be unpredictable, to keep everyone off balance, to arrest and execute some writers and be indulgent to others. He may also have been impressed by Bulgakov's directness, and while he had dismissed the Crimson Island as, quote, waste paper, end of quote, it seems he genuinely admired Days of the Turbans. In 1932, talking with the directors of the Art Theater during an intermission, he asked why the play was no longer being staged, and it was quickly returned to the repertoire. Stalin had attended the opening performance and eventually saw the play some 20 times. Quote, so it is hardly surprising, end of quote, writes Vladimir Lakshin, that in his radio broadcast to the Soviet people on July 3, 1941, announcing the German invasion. Quote, Stalin, searching for words which would go straight to the heart of each and everyone, consciously or unconsciously used the phraseology and intonation of Alexei Turbin's monologue on the staircase at the gymnasium. Quote, to you I turn, my friends, end of quote. The ambiguous relations between art and power are central to the two plays brought together here. Though one is about the long-past era of French classical theater and the other is an adaptation of an even older novel, Bulgakov filled them with the immediacy of his own world and its conflicts. He began work on The Cabal of Hypocrites in 1929, a few months after his plays were banned. Molière's Tartuffe had also been banned, and Molière had had many other run-ins with the authorities. Yet The Cabal is not simply a disguised self-vindication on Bulgakov's part, it is rather a broadening of Bulgakov's own struggles into an exploration of the fate of an artist in his confrontation with the forces of his time, an absolute monarch and a censorious church. The parallels are there, but the larger vision is there as well. The Cabal is also a play about the theater itself, the physical theater, the curtains, the wings, the dressing rooms, the stage within the stage, the cheering or hooting audience. It is finally a play about Molière acting out his life. Bulgakov finished the first version of The Cabal in early 1930 and submitted it to the Art Theater. After much discussion with members of the theater, the government's chief repertory committee decided that it did not properly reflect the class struggle and was therefore unsuitable for performance. A year and a half later, the play was reconsidered by the same committee, this time with support from Maxim Gorky, and was approved with the title changed to Molière. But the problems with the production did not end there. The contract Bulgakov received from the Art Theater stated on instructions from Stanislavski that the play would be produced no later than May 1st, 1933. Stanislavski wanted meanwhile to stage Bulgakov's adaptation of Gogol's Dead Souls, the first work the writer undertook in his new position as a member of the Art Theater. Dead Souls opened on November 28, 1932, was rather coolly received by the critics, but found its audience and remained in the theater's repertoire for several decades. Bulgakov was also busy with other things. He had started a new draft of The Master and Margarita the year before, and in the spring of 1932, he was commissioned to write a biography of Molière for the series Lives of Remarkable People, founded and directed by Gorky. His Life of Monsieur de Molière, a novelized biography and one of his finest prose works, was submitted to the editors in 1933, but they found that it did not conform to the guidelines of the series. Bulgakov refused to alter it, with the result that it was published only 30 years later. In March 1932, rehearsals for Molière had in fact begun, but the opening date kept being put off. Stanislavski fell seriously ill in the spring of 1933, went abroad for treatment, and did not come back to Moscow until August 1934. The Art Theater was also going through internal struggles between its older and younger members, which disrupted rehearsals. A new opening date was set for January 1935, and Stanislavski himself took over the production, but disagreements between author and director delayed things again. In October, Nemirovich Danchenko stepped in, and the play finally had its premiere on February 16, 1936. It was well received by the public, but the press was as hostile to Bulgakov as ever, and when a particularly harsh review entitled, quote, "External Glitter and False Content," end of quote, appeared in Pravda on March 9th, Molière was abruptly canceled. There had been only 7 performances. In September 1936, Bulgakov resigned from the Art Theater and went to work for the Bolshoi as a librettist and consultant. He had finished the first full version of The Master and Margarita in 1934, but kept making changes and additions. He had written several plays that had gone unproduced: Flight, 1928, Adam and Eve, 1931, Bliss, 1934, The Last Days, 1935, Ivan Vasilievich, 1935. In 1936, he began work on Theatrical Novel, a satirical rendering of his experiences in the Art Theater. A year later, he said in a letter to a friend, quote, "My last attempts to write for the theaters were the purest quixotry on my part. I shall never repeat that," end of quote. But at the end of the same year, after turning down several other suggestions, he signed a contract with the Vatangov Theater for a dramatization of Don Quixote. Bulgakov obviously had to be very selective in the episodes and characters he took from the immense text of the Quixote. But his work was not only a matter of concentration and elimination, he also added material that is not in Cervantes. For instance, while the peasant girl Aldonza Lorenzo, who was transformed in Quixote's imagination into his beloved Dulcinea del Toboso, never actually appears in the novel, Bulgakov brings her on stage twice: at the beginning, when Quixote kneels to her and recites chivalric poetry, and at the end, when the, quote, "cured," end of quote, Quixote acknowledges the prosaic truth. The love story of Quixote's niece Antonia and the scholar Sanson Carrasco in Act 3, Scene 5, and Act 4, Scene 9, a more mundane reality to balance the knight's ideal love for the inaccessible Dulcinea, is also Bulgakov's invention. The chatter of Meritorns, Polemek, and the mule driver in Act 2, Scene 3 comes from Bulgakov, as does most of the scene with the fire obra's Elixir. The slapstick play with masks in Act 3, Scene 5 is also pure Bulgakov, as is the dark and melancholy ending. Bulgakov's additions to passages that are in Cervantes also speak for his intentions in dramatizing the novel. His Quixote sets out on his path more knowingly, as he explains to Sancho at the very beginning, quote, "A poet and knight sings and loves not the one made of flesh and blood, but the one his tireless fantasy has created. I love her the way she appeared to me in my dreams. I love, O Sancho, my ideal," end of quote. The, quote, "poet," end of quote, and his, quote, "ideal," end of quote, are Bulgakov's words. When Sancho then dubs him the Knight of the Mournful Countenance, Quixote replies, quote, "The mournful knight has been born to turn our calamitous iron age into an age of gold," end of quote. And he calls Sancho to go with him, quote, "We will fly through the world to take revenge on the fierce and strong for their offenses against the helpless and the weak, to fight for insulted honor, to restore to the world what it has irretrievably lost, justice," end of quote. His idealism replaces the romantic and chivalric quests of Cervantes', quote, "mad," end of quote, knight, and his defeat at the end is the more profound and anguished. As he faces the disguised Sanson Carrasco in combat, he says to him, quote, "But something suddenly frightens me much more than the point of your sword. It's your eyes. Your gaze is cold and cruel, and I've suddenly begun to imagine that Dulcinea doesn't exist. No, she doesn't. My brow is bathed in cold sweat at the thought. She doesn't exist. But even so, I won't utter the words you're trying to tear out of me. There's no woman more beautiful, but your heart of iron cannot understand that, end of quote. At the very end, he says to Sancho, quote, the damage done me by his steel is insignificant, nor did he cripple my soul with his strokes. My fear is that he has cured my soul, and having cured it, has taken it out of me without replacing it with another. He has deprived me of the most precious gift a man is endowed with. He has deprived me of my freedom, end of quote. Bulgakov started work on Don Quixote in December 1937. He interrupted it to make a sixth full revision of The Master and Margarita, which was finished in May 1938, and then went back to the play. The two works influenced each other by turns. Near the end of the play, the dying Quixote says to Sancho, I want to look at the trees. See, the leaves are yellow. Yes, Sancho, the day is coming to an end, it's clear. I'm afraid because I am meeting my sunset quite empty, and there's nothing to fill that emptiness, end of quote. One of the last additions Bulgakov made to the novel in 1939 was the opening of chapter 32, Forgiveness and Eternal Refuge. Quote, Gods, my gods, how sad the evening earth, how mysterious the mists over the swamps. He who has wandered in these mists, he who has suffered much before death, he who has flown over this earth bearing on himself too heavy a burden knows it. The weary man knows it, and without regret he leaves the mists of the earth, its swamps and rivers. With a light heart he gives himself into the hands of death, knowing that she alone can bring him peace, end of quote. The two works, for all their differences, are both farewells. Dr. Bulgakov knew, before his fellow doctors officially diagnosed it, that he was suffering from hypertonic nephrosclerosis, the kidney disease that had taken his father's life in 1907. Don Quixote was finished in September 1938 and approved for production by the Chief Repertory Committee in January 1939, but the author did not live to see it. On April 27, 1940, 6 weeks after his death, the play was given its first performance at the Provincial Ostrovsky Drama Theater in Kaneshma, and a year later it opened at the Pushkin Theater in Leningrad and the Vakhtangov Theater in Moscow. In the half-century since Bulgakov's surprising reappearance, Molière has triumphed over the cabal of hypocrites, and Don Quixote has regained his freedom in Russia and in theaters throughout the world. Richard Pevear.